as on time as we possibly can, and we know your time is valuable and greatly appreciate you joining us today. We're here for a conversation with Brooke LePage, who's a member of the policy team at FutureEd about how FutureEd tracks state education legislation during COVID-19. And today we're going to put a particular focus on some of the elements of how COVID-19 has both changed state legislative tracking and also what it means as they interact from a policy capacity with their own stakeholders and report information back, with the hope being that this session can be informative to you all as you think about your strategy for engaging and tracking state legislation as we approach the 2021 state legislative sessions, and also can take away some best practices that you might be able to find helpful this fall. But where we want to start is, as we always do, with getting a little bit of an overview from Brooke on just, first off, what is FutureEd? And then second, to hear a bit about the impact that coronavirus has had on the education industry as we learn from her. So, Brooke, I'll turn it over to you, but tell us a little bit more. What is FutureEd?
Hi, Alex. Thanks so much for having me today. FutureEd is an independent, solution-oriented think tank at Georgetown University's McCourt School. Our work focuses on excellence, equity, and efficiency in K-12 and higher education on behalf of the nation's disadvantaged students. But more recently, as you can imagine, and as you said, our work has really been pivoting to focus on the impact of coronavirus on education. When schools started closing in the spring, it became really clear to us that the coronavirus was going to have a long-lasting impact on education. And at that point, we really shifted to researching and learning as much as we could about those impacts.
Significant. And, give us a sense, kind of the current pulse. We read in the news, there's a lot of conversation about schools reopening. What are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's certainly been a contentious topic of discussion, and we've seen it become really politicized in the last few weeks or so. When we started pivoting our research, it was really focused on what does distance learning look like for students? How is that impacting students and their learning? But more recently, we've just been really trying to keep up with the conversation. So last month for us, that looked like analyzing state guidance and what states were recommending for their districts and schools. But more recently, it's come down to the district level. So we've been trying to get an eye into what those conversations look like. And Quorum has been super helpful, both in our early work and more recently trying to get a grasp of that conversation. But decisions are still being made, so we are certainly just trying to keep up with it.
Significantly. And I'm sure we're going to dive in a little bit more to social media and the impact that it has on policy here in a minute. And then just out of curiosity, FutureEd, tell us a little bit about the history, particularly as it relates to your state legislative policy work. Was it from the very beginning that you decided, we need to be doing state legislative work, or when did that come in, and how has that really transformed and evolved over time?
Yeah, great question. Education is a really interesting example of federalism in the sense that it gets funding from all levels of government, and guidance is also coming from all levels of government. So while some issues exist almost exclusively on the national level, for education, it's really important to know what's going on at the state and local level. And so prior to the coronavirus, we were working with our great contacts at Quorum to think about tracking state legislation on a myriad of issues that are really important to FutureEd. And then when coronavirus hit, we thought to ourselves, what would be most beneficial for our audience, for policymakers, for teachers, for parents, for students. And we realized that we needed to pivot and start tracking legislation on education and coronavirus at the state level, so we could really get some insight into what state legislatures and executive branch members were hoping to use their dollars for.
I think that's a great segue here. So tell us a little bit about the impact that you're looking to have and kind of the objective that you set out with. So obviously, understanding that it's tracking the state legislation as it relates to coronavirus and schools reopening. But essentially, who are your stakeholders? Who are you reporting back to, and what were you looking out to be able to share with them?
Yeah, so we have a bunch of different audiences that we try to keep in mind with our work. So we want to be helpful and influential and informative for policymakers, for teachers, like I said, for school leaders, school and district leaders, for parents, for students. So we put out a bunch of different products that try to make policy accessible and understandable for a bunch of different audiences. So for our state legislation tracker specifically, we thought it would be helpful for almost all stakeholders to know what was going on at the state level. You know, some legislatures were not in session, but a bunch were. And at that time, the most direct action was coming out of those state legislatures. So that looked a lot like money for students who needed broadband access or who needed devices, ensuring students still had meals, school meals and things like that, sanitizing buildings. It was the immediate needs that students really needed. And so tracking state legislation gave us a great insight into that.
That's really helpful. And give us a little bit of the nitty-gritty details here. How have you gone about tracking the state legislation? And curious, you know, what were the search terms that you set out to look for, and how did you think about designing that strategy all the way through the who on your team is doing it, and then, you know, the big question of, okay, how do you present that information?
Yeah, I will say we had some great help from our contacts at Quorum because the search terms were very much not easy to come up with. It required a lot of Boolean terms. But once we had gotten search terms that were wide enough that we weren't missing anything, but narrow enough that I wasn't spending, you know, a million hours a day parsing through state legislation, we went with that. And then it was a matter of I checked it, I think, every day. And we, like I said, cast a wide net. So then I would have to read through the state legislation and say, is this what our audience is really interested, like, what role does this play in the conversation? Is this something that's going to be helpful for our audience to know? And once we felt like we had tracked enough bills, we were able to go through and code them and then find some common threads and identify trends to give us a broader idea of what state policymakers were working on at the time.
That's really helpful. Diving in just a level further, because I love the details. Any advice that you would have for folks listening in on setting out those search terms, realizing that, you know, it is figuring out that magic balance between how do you get, you know, enough without getting too much?
Yeah, it's really, really tough. I mean, first of all, I would say to work with your with your contacts at Quorum. I don't think we could have come up with as effective of a search term as we had without engaging somebody from your team to help us out, because you guys know it a lot better than we do, and we're still in the learning phases. But with that being said, we err on the side of casting a wider net. Yes, that means more work, but it also means that we're less likely to miss things. So like you said, it's just a matter of finding that sweet spot, but I'd say err on the side of caution.
Yep. For any of the Quorum clients that are listening in, one of my favorite features that we highly encourage folks to use is the analyze functionality in the search terms to give a sense about how many terms previously would have been pulled up based on a given subject, and find that that's a helpful way that we'll use internally and encourage our clients to use to get a sense of, is this going to be a ton of bills or is this going to be very few? And, you know, really, as Brooke mentioned, it's about layering on those individual terms so that you get lots of small items, but you get enough that you really get a coherent overview of an individual issue.
Yeah, that was really helpful for us. And also keeping up with it regularly was very helpful for me, because then the bills that I had to parse through were less, essentially. So that was really helpful in narrowing down the dates and just really keeping up with it. And we also love how Quorum can create like visualizations and identify patterns for us. So we also found that to be very helpful.
So, Brooke, tell us a little bit about your own personal strategy. Do you do it every morning at 10 a.m.? Does the time vary? How have you approached it in terms of reviewing legislation?
I was a first thing in the morning type of person. It was like the first thing I did once I started my workday. So I typically start at like 8:30 or so. And I thought that was important because I wanted we wanted it to be the type of product that people were coming back to and keeping up with. And because of that, we wanted it to be as up to date as possible. So I thought it was super important to do it in the morning so that when people found their way to it throughout the day, one way or another, it was updated and it was ready to go for them to use.
And give us a sense, how much time would you spend a day reviewing bills?
Initially, a lot more time than towards the end. You start to get a real feel for the things that you're looking for and the things that you're not. So in the beginning, I was really reading legislation almost verbatim, like the entire bill. And by the end of it, I was able to identify the common threads that were showing up in bills. So I could pull up a bill that was generated by our search for a couple of key terms or search words, and was able to go through them a little bit more quickly. But I would probably say anywhere from like, half an hour to an hour maybe, but it's so worth it and was such a helpful tool that the time is worth it to make sure it's accurate and up to date.
Yeah. One of the things that we often talk about when it comes to state legislation is, you look at the time investment that's involved. And the thought that I like to describe it as is it's an insurance policy. If you spend, an hour or so a day, especially when state legislatures are in session, then there's the opportunity to catch items that pop up that you might not have caught. And you catch one of those and that could have a major impact on shifting an entire policy issue. So really, when you think about it, like, yes, nobody necessarily wants to add another hour or 30 minutes to your day. But when it's something that's so essential, where it's the core of a policy focus, like, these bills could become law, and I think it really raises the importance of them. You mentioned,
I agree. And
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to mention that, especially when the tracker is like self-updating, that is also cutting out a lot of time that we otherwise would have spent. So it's well worth spending the time to find the right bills because, Quorum does the rest of the work for you once you do that.
So tell us a little bit about this tracker that you used, and what did the end product look like, and how did you present this or provide this to all of your stakeholders?
So we have a bunch of different sections of our website that are all different products, like I said, that are meant to be accessible for different types of audiences. So our tracker was under what we call explainers, and that typically is really dedicated for exactly like I said, making policy accessible and explaining, why is this important? What exactly does this mean? But it typically has a graphic element to it. So we had we generated the tracker within Quorum and then embedded it into a page on our site, and then had done some analysis at the top to complement it so people could see the bills, go directly to the bills, see the status of them, but they also didn't have to read all, a couple hundred of them or so to know the common trends, commonalities among states within states, because we had done that analysis for them at the top.
That's awesome. You're doing the hard work for them.
Yeah,
making it
a lot of
easy.
legwork.
So for folks listening in that are wondering more, one of the functionalities that we built probably about a year and a half ago into the Quorum platform is this ability to take a sheet of bills, as if you would put together your own individual Excel sheet, but actually embed that into your own website or make it accessible via a link that you can share with individuals. And then, as Brooke was mentioning, one of the best parts of it is the ability to actually go in and have the sheet auto update. So there's no more of, I got to go update that the status changed from X to Y, or that it's now in this committee, because that all happens. And so as you do the work on the front end, it then can provide this incredible resource to stakeholders, members, executives of, here's the legislation we're tracking. And you can also as well give them the source link to the bill so they can go straight to the state legislative website and find out more information from themselves. Brooke, I'm curious just a little bit on the tagging methodology you used. You mentioned you tagged it to some individual subcategories of the issue. Can you share with us a little bit about your tagging strategy? How many tags did you think about doing? And also, have you thought about doing different trackers for different tags, or how you make that accessible towards individuals?
Yeah, so within Quorum, we had just created one issue that we were tagging all of the bills to. And then we were so that's what generated the sheet that we could then put embed in our website. And then we were manually identifying common threads and then seeing what types of bills were popping up most commonly. So It took a little bit for us to do that because we had to have enough bills where we were able to actually identify things that had, or categories that had multiple bills. And then once we did that, it was a matter of reading them, seeing what exactly those buckets are. And like I said, in the beginning, it was a lot of K through 12 bills, a lot of allocating money for sanitizing schools and how often to sanitize schools, and ensuring that teachers were still getting their benefits even though they were teaching from home, or ensuring students had devices and broadband and were still getting their school meals. All of those really immediate, important needs. But then interestingly, we saw over time, the bill started to really focus on higher education. So things like refunding students for the unused meal plan credits and their housing that wasn't used once they had sent students home. So it was interesting to track them over time. A couple of other buckets we had was a lot of bills on things like student attendance. State laws set the number, I believe it's state laws, set the number of school days and the number and like what is considered or the amount of days when a student is considered chronically absent, things like that. So some of the bills were also waiving a lot of state laws. Like typically schools are required to have 180 days of school, but that might not be possible when things are in such flux. So waiving those types of laws. So there were a lot of interesting things that you just might not have thought of pre-pandemic for sure.
And I take it that you started to add different issues kind of as they came up, or you noticed a new trend. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, it was definitely interesting. You had to keep up with it because, like I said, things were constantly changing. So you had to keep an eye out for new things that you previously weren't anticipating. And like I said, before coronavirus, we had thought that we were going to have multiple trackers on a bunch of issues that have always been important to us and part of our mission and the work that we do. But we really ended up pivoting and focusing on coronavirus and identifying trends within that legislation.
Super helpful. If you had to go all the way back to the beginning and start it all over again, what would you have done differently, and what advice would you have for someone who's just starting out on the process?
Good question. I mean, things were and continue to change so quickly in the education landscape that I feel like I know so much now just about the landscape in general that I probably wished I would have known going into it. But I mean, this was our first time creating a tracker within Quorum, so I also think we learned a lot process-wise. Like I said earlier, I do think it's important we relied, and we're so grateful for the help that we received from our contacts at Quorum, creating that Boolean term, and you know, creating the tracker, and we learned how to embed it in our website, just a bunch of things that we had never done before. So I would just say stay engaged with people at Quorum because they're so knowledgeable and so helpful and so willing to help. Think about it from the audience side. Who is this helpful for, and how can it be most helpful for them, and to just make sure that it's up to date so that it is just like maximum helpful for people and really keeps them coming back. We found that to be pretty successful. We found people coming back to our tracker and really just continuing to engage with it. So definitely something important to keep in mind.
That's great. And as Brooke mentioned, obviously our team is happy to consult with many of the folks that are listening in if this is something that would be of interest. So both current clients, our customer success team is ready to sit down and kind of strategize from the very beginning of if you want to copy exactly what FutureEd and Brooke has done, very much an option, or also can think about how do we make this really relevant to you. And if anybody's on who's not a Quorum client, our account executive team spends a lot of time thinking about this and really thinking all the way through implementations and programs. And we're obviously happy to do that. A special part is that all happens at no cost. So it's not something that we charge for because we want people to really be successful with it. Brooke, my last kind of question on the bill tracking piece of this, you just mentioned a little bit, but is the metrics. How did you know it was working? How were you guys able to prove the return on investment or that it was providing value to your members? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we track web traffic and hits on different landing pages on our websites just using Google Analytics. And we found that to be continuously successful throughout the months. We tracked from, I think, early March or late March perhaps until early July. And we found that the web traffic was pretty consistent the whole time. It started to drop off at the end, especially as state legislatures were going out of session. There was slightly less activity, but we found web traffic to be consistent across the board. People were coming back and engaging. The amount of time that people spent on the landing page was pretty good for our website. We tweet out all of our work just to keep pushing it out there to our stakeholders, to our audience, and people were engaging with it on Twitter and tweeting about it and super excited about it. So good measurements all around.
That's awesome. So I just love the best practice there. Put Google Analytics on your website, which likely many of your websites already have it, as that's mostly how people measure web traffic.
Mm-hmm.
And then dive in and figure out, okay, number of visits in general, number of repeat and return visitors, and then average time spent on site is really wonderful ways to prove to an external audience about, is this valuable and is it having an impact? So we're going to transition here to talk a little bit about social media, but for those of you listening in, we do want to make this interactive, and we'll have time at the end for Q&A. If you drag your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, there should be a button that says Q&A on the bottom of the screen, and feel free to submit any questions that you have there. In addition, you also could throw a question into the chat if that seems easier for you. I'll make an effort to monitor both here. But any questions for Brooke about her program, how she put it together, tips for state legislative tracking, all of that is fair game, and we'll get to it in a minute. But one of the items that we just briefly touched on at the beginning was this role that social media in the conversation has played. And so I want to spend a little bit of time on this, which, Brooke, you mentioned there's been a bit of a challenge of figuring out what's going on with reopening. Tell us a bit again about the challenge that you've faced, and then how you've worked to be able to find out information based on the conversations that are happening online.
Yeah, like I said, education is a pretty textbook example of federalism, and because of that, the conversation is happening on an unimaginable number of levels, and we felt like there was a pretty good grasp on the conversation happening at the national level, but as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to know what state legislators and executive branch leaders are thinking, what they're working on, what they're saying, and we saw during the month of July, the debate about reopening schools had become pretty politicized, or at least that was our inclination. And we kind of set out to see if that was true and to see what the conversation and the debate was really looking like at the state level. And as somebody who loves Twitter and gets a lot of information that way and loves to find new work and connect with new people that way, we thought about the feature in Quorum where you can actually track tweets. And so we sought to track the intersection of basically the politicization of reopening schools and face masks, and the intersection of those issues. We sought to see what people were saying about that, and what state legislators and executive branch members were saying about the role of face masks in reopening schools. So we used Quorum's feature to track tweets and created another fun search term that, again, was broad enough to not miss anything, but narrow enough that I wasn't reading 5,000 tweets a day about the intersection of the issues. And we thought that that was an important way to give us and our readers and our stakeholders insight into what is happening at the state level. Like I said, I think people are pretty clear with what's happening at the national level, but sometimes people need a little more information on what's happening at the state level, especially if it's not the state that they live in. So we thought it would be a helpful tool and just give people an insight or a glimpse into that debate.
And did you just focus on tweets, or did you also look at Facebook posts too?
We just looked at tweets, but I'm not sure the level of which state legislatures and executive branch leaders use Facebook as a tool to communicate. I know there's also an option to include text from their newsletters to constituents. I did think about including that as well, but we wanted to have a narrow view, so we thought we would just focus on tweets. And Twitter is pretty, I know different social media platforms are important for different industries, and Twitter has been proven to be pretty important to the policy world and to the education world. So we thought it was the best medium for us to track.
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. What we see is, Twitter is very frequently used to communicate to media, to other policymakers, really to kind of policy influencers that are all watching it and participating on the platform. For those listening in, of the 7,300 state legislators, 50% of them are on Twitter, and 75% are on Facebook. And what's actually interesting here is we do see legislators more active on Facebook, but they're using it more often than not to communicate to their constituents, where those are the individuals that go log into Facebook because they want to see, what's up with their grandkids or what's happening in the neighborhood with, the neighbor's daughter. And that is all examples of just the kind of change in communication between the platforms. So I think, Brooke, you probably made the right decision here of you want it just simpler and narrower. And so just go with Twitter to get a sense of where the policy conversation's moving. But as folks listening in are thinking about, how broad do you want to be versus how specific, relevant really to think about both of those platforms. And we've seen a huge increase in use on both. We just put out a state legislative trends report yesterday that found that after the coronavirus hit, the number of Facebook posts from state legislators increased 100%. So basically double the amount of conversation online. And I think it really does start to speak to where the conversation online becomes essentially a precursor for the policy decisions that are effectively made, whether that be in a state bill or whether that be in an opening of schools or a closing of schools. So given that note, Brooke, I'm curious, how did you take all of this conversation that you were tracking and communicate that in a way that made sense to your members and provided a resource that was helpful?
Yeah, so again, this was working a lot with Quorum to see the type of output that we could pull from Quorum and put on our website that was visually appealing, but also as informative as possible. So we ended up having two products that we pulled from Quorum and provided our own analysis of what we had learned from both of those. So one product was a 26-page PDF of all of the just shy of 300 tweets that we had tracked. That was really important because, and the reason it ended up being 26 pages is because it was important to see the whole tweet. And in some of the other like download functions, or if we had put more than a certain amount per page, you couldn't see the full tweet. But the whole point was really seeing what they were saying and getting an insight into that conversation. So we had the PDF so people could go through and read, and that was organized by date. So you could see that on, I believe it was July 7th, President Trump was hosting the reopening schools event at the White House, and you could go to July 7th and see that a bunch of state legislators started tweeting about the event or in response to it. So we thought it was helpful to have it by date in that sense, so we and our readers could identify some trends that way. But then we had a separate product, which was a link to a Google Sheet, which we were able to sort by state. So if you just wanted to say, what are they talking about in my state, you could go to that sheet instead and just see what your state legislators and executive branch leaders were saying. So we thought that both were important because we could see our readers wanting, are thinking along both of those trains of thought. So we had both of those, and then we had, like I said, some analysis at the top to identify some trends, just in case people didn't have the time to read through 300 tweets and think about, compare and contrast. So we weren't super surprised with the trends that we had found, but we thought that the overall product was really helpful for people and even for us to learn. So it ended up being really great.
Yeah. And then on the tracking piece of it, it sounds like you were going through and reviewing a larger sub-series of tweets to just filter down to the 300 relevant ones.
Right, yeah. Sorry, I meant to mention more of the nuts and bolts. You're right. So we created a search term that was some version of like education or school and face masks or face coverings. or just like masks and coverings. And so that again brought up a boatload of tweets, more than we ended up tracking. And then I would go through and say, is this really in the wheelhouse of what we're looking for, or is this a little bit too out of scope? And then would again tack them to an issue that was then able to generate that PDF and also some really cool visualizations for us.
That's awesome. So for the folks listening in, this is one of the key reasons why we wanted Brooke to join us today, is just the advanced level here of the tracking of social media that goes on. We see, vast majority of our clients will set up the alerts because obviously helpful information to get on a one-off and get a sense of, oh, the governor of Michigan just said this, we're probably going to need to respond in Y way. But there's also a more advanced application here that Brooke's been doing of actually going in and treating social media tracking similarly to bill tracking and reviewing what's relevant, what's not relevant, tagging that, being able to then present it to an external audience. And also the part that I always find the most fascinating is look at the trends and be able to see how these topics are changing over time. Brooke, I'm curious on the trends piece. Did you find anything interesting as you were looking at the trends of what individuals were saying on social? And can you share with us a little bit about what you found?
Yeah, so we found that Democrats were accounted of the tweets that were associated with political parties. We found that Democrats had tweeted 3 times more than their Republican colleagues. And we were perhaps unsurprised by this, and a lot of the tweets were encouraging their communities to wear face masks now, connecting that wearing face masks now directly to the ability to reopen schools in a couple of weeks. So that accounted for a lot of the tweets. Also, when state guidance was released, a lot of legislators would respond with their thoughts about the guidance that was released. And the state guidance was coming out of state departments of education and health. So people, like I said, would respond to that. But a lot of legislators were using like hashtags to encourage their communities to wear face masks, again, as if reopening schools really depends on it. So that was really interesting for us. We also saw that the first 3 weeks of July, each week had more tweets than the last. The 4th week of July had a slight drop off, but for the most part, each week was having more and more tweets on the matter as it was getting increasingly politicized and just becoming a bigger debate.
I think that's fascinating, and it's an interesting breakdown to look at the share of the conversation that an issue is taking, and is it increasing or decreasing, because it helps to put a little bit in perspective of, okay, how big of a topic of conversation. And obviously on this issue, I think it's easier. You watch the nightly news, you read the newspaper, and suddenly, boom, big issue. But on something that might be a little more nuanced, you sit there and I think sometimes struggle with, okay, is this a small little blip or is this a growing movement?
And the thing that's amazing is in an ideal world, we would have tracked what they were saying about reopening schools hard stop throughout the month of July. But the fact that such a niche search of the intersection of face masks and reopening schools yielded 300 tweets just in the month of July shows you just how often these conversations and debates are happening, and on so many levels and about so many different components of reopening schools. This was one small facet, but it still yielded so many tweets and a lot of interesting, patterns. So it's just interesting to think about what this means for the greater conversation.
Yeah. And on that, one of the things that I really encourage clients to do is to try and put things in perspective. So sometimes when you pull up a visualization, you see just this skyrocketing chart, and this is true with any visualization, but try and put in another search term and look at, okay, reopening with masks compared to just reopening schools. And you can start to really quickly get a read on how big is an individual issue. And for anybody who's joining us on the corporate side, we find this really helpful in crisis response to get a sense of, all right, something negative happened. How big of an issue are policymakers reacting to it? Is this something where the reaction is, way higher than it has ever been for any conversation on an issue or the company's name? Or is it something where the reaction is moderate and you've got some legislators that are obviously concerned, but it's not something that there needs to be an overreaction to? And that's where just this social media piece can just be such a fantastic pulse on it, and an opportunity really then to go back and track individually. Brooke, the kind of last question that I have on the social media piece, did you think about doing any engagements with folks once you saw their tweets? Did you like them? Did you engage with legislators in any way? Or was it mostly just focused on the reporting piece of it?
Yeah, like I said, we try to be really engaging with our organization's Twitter account. I encourage everybody to check it out. We tweet out our work, we tweet it at people. I think it's a great way to engage with people. So independently of this project, we try to engage with a bunch of different stakeholders, including legislators. But for this project specifically, we really were just looking to get insight into the conversation. But I did see somebody tweeted our tweet tracker at somebody who had a tweet in the tracker and was like, I saw your tweet. So it was certainly catching the attention of a couple people who had tweets in there. So that was kind of fun.
That's awesome. And for people listening, what is the Twitter handle? Is it just at FutureEd?
I believe it's at FutureEdGU.
Okay. At FutureEdGU. So another great example about using a Twitter account to influence the policy process. We did an awesome webinar last week with the team over at Fidelity that just launched a policy Twitter account, probably in a similar vein to the at FutureEdGU Twitter account. And so that was literally worth a whole separate conversation. But if this piques your interest, would very much encourage everyone to go out and check out that webinar. Brooke, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just going to mention, like I said, different platforms just seem to be most appropriate for different industries, but we certainly have found that Twitter, compared to, we have a bit of engagement on LinkedIn. I believe we do have a Facebook page, but we have found Twitter by far for our organization and the type of work that we produce has been by far the most engaging, and it allows us to connect with other organizations in our space, our stakeholders, policymakers who are reading our research. So it certainly depends on the industry, but for us, we found Twitter to be really important. So it's good to hear that Fidelity was finding the same.
And so tell me a little bit about that. So you, in terms of what you decide to share on Twitter, I obviously assume you're sharing the trackers on Twitter, but if you get a new relevant bill, do you share that and put that out on Twitter, or kind of what makes the cut for your Twitter account?
Yeah, so we try to tweet some of our work out at least once an hour. We also try to engage with other people that work in our space. When we were tweeting out the tracker, actually for a while, I would tweet it out right after I updated it, and I would caption it with what I thought was either the most interesting, the most important, or most absurd bill that I had seen that morning. And that typically would find some engagement because people would be like, oh wow, is that what they're talking about? Or like, this is great, like I want to learn more about that bill. So that certainly would engage people. I would do the same on my personal account if I found like a bunch of bills that day that were just like right on the money or really missing the mark. And again, people were really excited about it for sure.
All right, I gotta ask, because you piqued my curiosity. What was the most absurd bill that you identified during your entire tracking process?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I'm not even sure I could recall because we haven't been tracking since the beginning of July. But I remember there being a couple that I was like, this is just, we kind of have bigger fish to fry, I think, than what this is addressing. But for the most part, the bills were pretty right on the money. Like I said, really addressing students' immediate needs. But wow, I might have to get back to you on some of the crazy ones, or take a look at the tracker and decide for yourself.
There we go. And your Twitter account is?
Oh, it's at @B_LePage.
So you go to @B_LePage. Not only should you hopefully find some absurd bills in her Twitter feed, but maybe she'll even follow up from this conversation with a highlight reel of some of her favorites. Brooke, kind of taking a step back out, we're sitting here in this pandemic looking at a socially distanced world for at least the next 5 or 6 months as we wait for a vaccine, and possibly longer. What's next for FutureEd, both as you think about the fall with the pandemic continuing, and then also as you think about state legislative sessions coming back in the spring of 2021?
Yeah, great question. We're continuing to research both the short-term and long-term impacts of the pandemic on education and the nation's disadvantaged students. And there is so much work to be done, and we're slowly realizing that we're really just getting started. And like I said, things have been changing so fast. When we were reading through and analyzing all 50 states reopening guidance, it was really sounding like schools might do a hybrid model, or like they were trying to do in-person learning, but slowly it's been shifting, and as it becomes more political, and as the health aspects are evolving, schools are starting to say that they're gonna at least start off virtual. We saw some schools have already opened in person. There were some schools in Georgia that we saw open last week, in the last few weeks. So things are changing so fast, and decisions are now really being made on the local district level and by school leaders. So we are continuing to keep up with the conversation and see what schools are doing, and researching and watching and learning, and really continuing, like I said, to understand both the short-term and long-term impacts of the pandemic on education. In some ways it's scary because we don't know what it's going to be like, but in some ways it's a really empowering and exciting opportunity for education to meet students where they're at and really address their needs. So I think, like I said, we just have to keep up with the conversation, stay ahead of it, and really do as much as we can for students right now.
Well, I think that's a great way to end some of your remarks today. I do want to open it up for questions. So if anybody listening in has a question, please feel free to bring your mouse to the bottom left-hand side of the screen and click the Q&A button, or you can feel free to just put it in the chat as well. We're looking at both. So if you have a question, feel free and submit it. And Brooke, while we have folks do that, tell us a little bit about 2021. How are you thinking about state legislatures coming back into session? Are you all, and what are you thinking about your strategy for the new year?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, in the spring, we saw that some were operating remotely, some were on temporary, like they weren't in session temporarily while they figured out what was going on in the pandemic. So I think we're just going to have to continue to monitor which ones are currently in session. But it might be worth bringing the legislation tracker back as school has started. I think the summer has seen a lot of guidance and a lot of planning, but especially as schools have tall orders and tight budgets, we're going to have to keep an eye on where the money's coming from, and it might be important to start tracking state legislation again. So definitely something that we're thinking about.
Yep. As I assume many of the folks on the webinar are, this provides us a nice time as we prepare for 2021. But hopefully the conversation today has helped giving you some ideas to think about how you might bring state tracking and even advance your state legislative tracking to include both social media as well as sharing information back through a formal tracker as FutureEd has. I'm not seeing any questions, so we're going to advance to the final two items today. One is just a quick highlight that yesterday we released our 2020 State Legislative Trends Report. So if you go to quorum.us/2020 state trends, our team put together 25 pages of analysis on the trends that we're seeing coming out of state legislatures, as well as sprinkled in are some live quotes from Quorum clients about how they've been reacting and what they're seeing on the ground. That I think provides a really good sense of what is currently happening across all state legislatures, and a little bit of what to expect both come this fall and next year. So would encourage you to go and check that out. And then as always, would end just here with a quick ask for you to fill out the following survey. Let us know how we did today, and if this conversation was helpful, as well as if you're interested in more resources, whether it's the slides that we used today, how Quorum or our team might be able to help you think through your legislative strategy, or if you just want to stay on our list for more best practices. So with that, we really appreciate, Brooke, you taking the time to join us and share with us a little bit about your work. Really exciting what you all have been doing. And again, I would encourage you to check out FutureEd on Twitter at FutureEdGU, or also at B_LePage on Twitter too. So a big thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex.